I just wrapped up my first year at UH Mānoa, so this is still the beginning of my my time at UH. So thanks again to Converse for inviting me to talk. I also wanted to thank my advisor, Dr. Erin Petreska, and several of my collaborators at the USGS, as well as Washington State and University of Massachusetts. I have two pictures here for you. To the left is Ahu'aila'au. It is a photo of the vent of the voluminous phase of the 2018 rift eruption. Ahu'aila'au is the name that the Hawaii State Board on Geographic Names gave to Fissure 8. And this is its beautiful image here. On the right, I have a picture of Pele. I'm sure some of you know Pele. She is considered widely to be the goddess of our volcano, of Hawaiian volcanoes. And I'm gonna kind of give you an introduction to her later on in this talk. But I wanted to begin by saying I am Native Hawaiian, Kanaka Maoli, whose ancestors come from the Aina of Oahu and Moku o Ke'awe, which is the Big Island. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Aina in which I speak to you all from is the island of Oahu, and I'm in currently the Ahupua'a of Moanalua. Is part of the larger territory recognized by Kanaka as our ancestral grandmother, Papahanau Moku. I recognize that Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani yielded the kingdom to the United States military, and this was under duress and protest to avoid the bloodshed of her people by the foreign colonial power of the United States of America. And I encourage you, wherever you're tuning in from, to consider those who stewarded those lands before you, even if you don't know their names, just consider them and who they would have been. Mahalo. So to summarize my talk, I'm going to be introducing Kīlauea to you folks. Over the last 40 years, it's been super active. The notable eruptions are Pu'u'o'o, Hale Ma'uma'u, and the 2018 Lower East Rift Zone eruption. Then I'm going to talk about the nature of the summit and rift connection and how that nature is really important to understand. It's very complicated. My research focuses on estimating summit storage volumes based on geochemical methods, which is a really unique methodology that I'm going to explain in my talk. And then we're going to shift to what the summit might look like now. And this is kind of a little bit beyond what I have done this past year, but I'm going to talk to you folks about it to give us some perspective and some of my research directions. And then I'm going to end with understanding Pele, who she is, and how we can understand her as volcanologists. So let me get started. Kīlauea in this map here is the map of the East Rift Zone. Kīlauea is comprised of a summit, and you can think of the summit as like your head, and then the arms of the volcano are the rift zone. So we have the Southwest and the East Rift Zone. The Southwest Rift Zone remarkably had an eruption a couple months ago, but it is the East Rift Zone that has been by far the most active. And the summit to rift connection was first understood by Native Hawaiians before the observatory was established in the 1900s, because Native Hawaiians lived here for like hundreds of years and made interpretations of their environment. And here's a quote from William Ellis, who was I think was a missionary, but he wrote a lot of things down. Pele went by road from her house underground to the shore. So her house is Hale Ma'uma'u is where she lives. So in 2008, Hale Ma'uma'u erupted for about a decade and then woke back up in 2020. But all while that was happening, we had the 35-year-long Pu'u'o'o eruption from 83 to 2018. And then we had the 2018 Lower East Rift Zone eruption. And these are all really remarkable. I have this, and what I think and many think is remarkable because there is interconnectedness, not only of the eruptions, but also of the plumbing system. And I'll get into those details. But just so we're all on the same page, let's understand, I have my mouse here, so I'm gonna be looking this way. Pu'o'o was the long eruption. Hopefully you folks can see my cursor, and apologies if you can't. That lasted 35 years, and it wasn't until 2008 that there was 2 eruptions happening at the same time. The summit, Halemaumau, was about 10 years, and then in 2018, the summit began to collapse, and over the course of several months, the lower East Rift zone erupted. But the summit and Pu'o'o both terminated within days of one another before that volumetric outburst of the lower East Rift zone. And then 18 months later, the summit reawakened for about 5 eruptions from 2020 to 2023. So there's these interesting temporal distributions. And I have just a quick summary of the rift eruption here, of the lower East Rift eruption here. But most of this talk will focus on Pu'o'o and Halemaumau, both before and after 2018. So we understand the summit to rift connection as a summit where the magma is coming up from where it's being generated to collect in the summit reservoir. And the reservoir kind of connects to the rift zone variably depending on the type of eruption that's occurring. So for example, Pu'o'o, this is a profile from the summit to the rift, the summit to the rift. Summit to the rift right here. There are other ways you can draw this drawing. Many geologists have, and this is just one example of a schematic during Pu'o'o. But the same concept holds for most models of the summit to rift connection. There can be variable like storage and open system for Pu'o'o. That's not really the focus of this talk. There's much to be learned about it. But one concept I did want us to cover very briefly is that the summit and the rift has been hydraulically connected in some way throughout the different eruptions and eruptive stages when there's a summit and a rift eruption. So this is around 2010, 2011. Matt Patrick and others from the USGS showed this summit and Pu'o'o kind of moving together in tandem with their inflation and deflation events. So this is a common a concept that's been studied and litigated a lot. And there's a lot to be learned about that. But just for our purposes today, understand that the rift and the summit can be hydraulically connected, and what happens at the rift and the summit can affect one another. Yeah. What we understand the summit to be are generally 2 magma bodies, and this is the case for pre-2018, but I'll spoiler alert, this is also the case for after 2018. But just most of the work's been done before 2018, of course, because there's only been a couple of eruptions since 2018. But just so we're all I want to make sure we understand the schematics. I'm going to go into some detail about the 2 reservoirs. So there's the Halemaumau reservoir that's considered to be shallower and smaller than the deeper South Caldera reservoir. And the Halemaumau reservoir is like 1 to 2 kilometers, and the South Caldera is like 3 to 5. And not only are they like ones on top of the other, but they're kind of on this map. This is a map face of Kīlauea, Kīlauea caldera. They're kind of like on different, what is the word? They're kind of like separate from, they're not directly above one another is what I'm trying to say. And so you can think of these 2 reservoirs as like a system, because like the rift zone, the 2 reservoirs can interact with one another as well. One can shrink and there can be a blockage, and they can affect each other. And that's something that can be observed geodetically. And we know that there are 2 reservoirs pre-2018 because there are deformation centers in those areas, as well as changes in gravity in those areas. And here's just an example of some of the data points that help us understand the two reservoirs. It's also fascinating that the two reservoirs can be spotted geochemically, and it has to have certain conditions, and I can explain more about that if you have questions at the end. But this is a map of Kīlauea showing lava flows actually from they're older, before Pu'o'o. So the triangles are all samples from 1971 to 1982, and these were a series of summit eruptions before Pu'o'o awoke. And this was the last summit eruptive period until 2008. But that's not important. But what is important is that if you look at the chemistry of these flows, they're geographically different. They're the ones that are closer to the South Caldera Reservoir have have like higher magnesium content than the ones that are closer to the Halemaumau Reservoir. And so people have thought that explains that's evidence for the geochemical that's geochemical evidence for the two reservoirs. Let me move on. Now here's where it gets a little dicey and quite contentious, I would say. The volume estimates for the Summit Reservoir have been done both geophysically and a little bit geochemically. So geophysics, the way I think about it is they would model seismic anomalies, geodetic data, and stuff like that, deformation data to estimate the volume of the reservoirs. And so those estimations kind of vary a lot, even on orders of magnitude. During the Pu'o'o eruptive period, the summit could have been estimated from like 0.1 to 0.6 for the top reservoir and like 13 to 27 kilometers cubed for the bottom reservoir. However, for geochemical estimations, and there haven't been as much for several reasons, the estimations are way smaller. Those estimations are based on modeling of geochemical temporal trends. And that's actually what I'll be showing you all today. So this is kind of like a caveat saying the geochemical estimates don't really align with the geophysical estimates all the time. And that's totally, I would say that's expected, the two different methods, right? And one reason for that could be is because it's possible that when we have a lava, that is what we're sampling. When we sample a lava, that could represent like a hotter molten core within like a crystal mush ductile zone that could appear differently to a geodeticist or a geophysicist. With a lava, that's based on modeling of the geochemistry, and those exact methods I'm going to get into right after this, but it's two different, it could be the geophysics and the geochemistry could disagree because we're kind of thinking about the system in a different way. I don't have the answers to this. I don't think anyone does, but that's something to think about. This study, I'm focusing on deriving the volume of the last decade of the 2018, of the Summit Reservoir before the 2018 eruption, before the summit cut off. And so you can see the estimates for the geochemical estimates of the volume kind of ends like even before Pu'o'o. So I'm picking up at a different, more recent volume estimate. All right, now before I get into my model, so we're all understanding what exactly happened at the end of the 2018 eruption and what happened with the summit. This is a video of time lapse of the collapse of Kīlauea caldera, Kūlauea. I'll play it one more time so it can be nice and distracting while I talk. You can see the amazing collapse. This is over the course of several months. All the while there was the outpouring at the Lower East Rift Zone. It was episodic, and it deepened by about 0.8 cubic kilometers, while the lower East Rift outpoured over a cubic kilometer of lava. Also in 2018, the summit volume has been estimated using geophysical methods already, right leading up to during the 2018 eruption, or right before, I think. That estimate kind of varies a lot, and requires a certain amount of the volume removed and for the 2018 eruption, and requires the summit to have a sustained like magma body that was left over and didn't all vacate in 2018. And so there's a couple things here that are really interesting, and of course I don't have all the answers, but you know, it's stuff I've been thinking about. Like there's kind of there was more magma erupting than what was removed, and like, you know, how like there's like way more magma stored than what was removed, and like what is that, can we see that geochemically, the magma that was left behind? Those are questions that are currently being asked, and I have some thoughts on that later on in this talk. But for what I'm going to get into now is using geochemical trends to try to get my own value of this estimate. All right, so here I have a curve of ICP-MS-derived trace elements from Washington State University. And you'll see a lot of things here. Each square is a whole rock data point, or each data point is a whole rock lava bulk rock chemistry. And the most of the color, all the color data in color are new from the work this past year, and there are some literature data in the gray squares, except for the 2018, but I'll get into that. But before I start talking about these trends, I wanted to talk about like largely what we're observing. So in Hawaiian lavas, niobium is very highly incompatible, and yttrium is the least incompatible of what we measure in this method. It's still highly incompatible, but it's definitely not as highly incompatible as niobium. So I think I would call it moderately incompatible, not quite sure. But the point is that niobium over yttrium is an excellent source tracer for the source of our magmas being generated at Kīlauea. So just to kind of walk us through the data that we see really quickly, we have Pu'o that began in 1983, and we have these steady chemical trends where it decreases, increases, decreases again, and kind of flattens here. And these fluctuations haven't really been explained, and that's a story for another time. But what I'm going to talk about here is the recent period with all these dynamic eruptions kind of appearing and happening. And so the Pu'o kind of flattens, and then it increases in niobium for the first time in a while, right around 2010, 2011. And in around that period, 2008, that's when Halemaumau awoke and erupted until 2018. And then we have the 2018 lower East Rift eruption, kind of tails off into the high niobium yttrium ratios. And lastly, 2020 to 2023, the data kind of flattens at these niobium yttrium values. So I'm going to zoom into this period because that's the focus of where the geochemical model comes into play. Great. So this is the zoomed in version with the data from this project. A couple of things of note that it will be impossible to litigate during this talk, but it's something to keep in mind, or something that's interesting to me, and I'm sure some of you. The 2018 and the 2018 lower East Rift volumetric phase of the eruption, Ahu'aila'au, is statistically a different population than the 2020 2020 to 2023 lavas, which is very interesting. I understand that some folks might have thought that maybe 2018 represented a new batch of magma that has now arrived at the summit. That might not necessarily be true according to the chemistry, but I'm not, unfortunately, going to litigate that for this talk. But it's just really interesting to think about the dynamics of the 2018 eruption. But we're going to go back in time to before the 2018 eruption, because this is still really interesting and impactful and consequential. So this is cool. The last decade of Pu'o'o, when the summit was also active, they shared a temporal trend in trace element chemistry. You'll kind of see there's a temporal, like they're harmonious in the rate in which they're increasing until 2017. There is an offset of I call it like the Pu'o'o trend in purple from the rest of the summit samples. So before 2017, the summit and Pu'o'o were kind of harmonious in chemistry. And then 2017, something happened and the chemistry diverged from one another sharply. And so that is something I've been investigating, and I'm going to talk to you folks about what that might mean. But before that, I'm going to get into how I make the volume estimates. Essentially, what I'm doing is modeling this curve to match a residence time based on the mass balance of niobium and yttrium during this time period. So essentially, the mass balance, the arithmetic works out in this way. The concentration of the trace element in equals the concentration of the trace element out. And so the change in the mass of the reservoir, dm over dt, equals the input of magma minus the output of magma, minus the mass loss to fractional crystallization. And hopefully that mass balance makes a lot of sense intuitively. And second, through many iterations and simplifications of the initial equation, I integrate and rearrange the equation in order to have to iterate over a variety of residence times highlighted in this side of the equation, tau, through time. So what that looks like is once I iterate over the variety of residence time, I chose like 1 to 10 years just to start. I can estimate the volume using an assumed magma supply rate. And so the main goal of this slide is just so you can see that I have an equation that is based on the mass balance of niobium and yttrium, and I'm trying to match the temporal trends of my data, and hopefully that makes sense and you're not lost. So I'm going to start off with the initial conditions of my mass balance modeling. So I am testing the mixing conditions or the mixing of an existing magma with an input magma. And so my existing magma is the composition in the purple square, and I'm inputting the final composition that we observe in 2020. And so it's kind of like we reach the 2020 composition, and these conditions, I have a couple of reasons I wanted to tell you as to why I chose them and why they're worth testing. First off, this is an inflection point in 2010, not only in the chemistry, but also in some of the summit inflation data. And so while this is something I found independent of the point that I chose for the initial sample. So this summit inflation, it would be reasonable to test if this is an input magma coming in to fill the summit reservoir system. And this is also consistent with some of the crystal chemistry as well, but I don't unfortunately have time to get into that. Then for the final, I think I misspoke, initial input. For the input magma, that would be what I would reach in once the model is complete, once it's at the final composition. I chose the 2020 to 2023 composition because it's homogeneous and flat, and also it's higher than the rest of the temporal trends. It ends kind of at the top. So I'm going back to my curve. Here are the residence times that I plotted for the input and initial magmas. So just to kind of explain some of these lines, tau equals 1 is this black curve kind of with the greatest curvature. That is the residence time of a magma system or a magma reservoir system that is very short, 1 year. That is not realistic for our model. None of our data really plots along anywhere before like 2 or 1 year. So those are way too short. The end of the Halemaumau trend, where it kind of offsets from the rest of the curve, matches between like 3 to 4 years in residence time, while the main trend, the Pu'o trend, the residence time matches closer to 6 to 7 years. So these are two different residence times. And if you have questions about this, happy to discuss later. This is where I'm at now. So of course, I just wrapped up my first year. My next task is to understand, like, we have this change in residence time. This corresponds to a change in volume, but this also corresponds to a perturbation of the system. Oops. So in 2017, before the 2018 collapse of the summit caldera and the rift zone, the lower east rift zone eruption, there was a detectable offset in the lava chemistry, and that's really significant because that could those dynamics could have come into play with what happened in 2018, a year later. So I'm gonna kind of march through a couple of ideas that I have and how I'm thinking about this next phase of the project. So around 2011 to 2016, we have this kind of in-sync summit system that corresponds to about 0.8 to 1.2 cubic kilometers. Quite small, a lot smaller than the estimate from the previous slides by Anderson and others, which was 3 to 7 cubic kilometers with like give or take. So this could represent a time period where both the eruptions are well connected with one another. And there's different schematics as to how that might be. And that's something that I'm gonna examine and test. So well-connected, harmonious summit to rift system. Then in 2017, Pu'o'o and Halemaumau disconnected from one another. And that corresponds to 2 volumes. The summit has 1 volume and the rift has 1 volume. And let me just say, I don't mean that Pu'o'o has a large volume in the rift zone. I'm saying that wherever its source has a larger volume. So that could be at some point in the summit reservoir system, the South Caldera Reservoir or something like that. I am not hanging my hat on exactly which reservoir was responsible for which, but what I can say is that there could have either been a shrinkage of part of the system, a blockage on part of the system, or the system disconnected from one another in some way. This is all like exciting and not fleshed out completely, but this is how I'm thinking about the next phases of this project. Great, so on to the final couple slides. The state of the reservoir after the collapse. Geophysicists say there are 2 reservoirs still. That's pretty amazing. In the similar spots as to where the reservoirs were before the collapse. So here's 2 models as to where the reservoirs might be. And it's a really interesting paper about like the spheres and stuff like that. But yeah, so it's 2 reservoirs. That's really significant. After the collapse, the big collapse that we saw in the video. From the geochemical record, this is just a very brief summary of what the geochemical record says about the state of the reservoirs. specifically the olivine record. That's not something I'm focusing on presently. Just very basically, prior to the 2018 collapse, there aren't very many zoned olivine in the reservoir system, and that is thought to represent like a continuous mixing of the system, which is consistent with the lava chemistry. However, in 2020, Kendra Lin, she published a paper in 2024, but in 2020, those olivines are actually bimodal. Half are normally zoned and half are unzoned, and she's not finding evidence for magma mixing, in particular the shallow reservoir. And so that kind of conflates with the estimate of the summit volume from the geophysics estimates, saying that only part of the reservoir was vacated for 2018. But essentially, like ongoing, I'm trying to reconcile the lava chemistry of the 2020s with the crystal record. And so it's just something I've been thinking about as I work with Kendra and others. Great. So what does the lava say? I talked about before 2018 and estimating the volume from lava chemistry, but I didn't actually talk about like the lava chemistry itself in that detail. All of this is new data, glass and whole rock of major elements. So I have on the left potassium and on the right aluminum. And so what I want to focus here is on Halemaumau in 2020 and 2021. So 2020 is this green field, 2021, excuse me, to 2023. So the rest of the other 4 eruptions is in the blue field. And then you can also see Pu'u'o and Halemaumau are kind of off from before 2018, are kind of away from the new data, which is very interesting. But what's notable about the recent lava chemistry, not only in the olivine record that Kendra found, but there are these like morphologies that I'm really fascinated by. And my advisor says it's one thing, and I think it's another. But this is another test that I'm running, because I'm really fascinated by the chemistry that I observe in these lavas. So these the 2020 eruption has these like frothy, stringy guys, and these smooth, dense lava bits, and these rough looking, I call them like nerds. They look like nerd candy, so they're kind of crunchy looking. And they're all like just in the baggie that was collected by HVO scientists in 2020. They're all kind of mixed together. So who knows if they were erupted in layers or in sequence, or if they all kind of erupted at the same time. That's not something I can say. But what I can say is that the chemistry is different for these different groups. In particular, the rough lavas kind of have this like tail out here into higher potassium contents. And I'm gonna just switch over, and also higher aluminum contents. And where I'm kind of going with this last bit of geochemical data is that the next phase of this project is to really examine these different morphologies, and especially as it relates to the 2021 to 2023 summit samples that don't have those 3 morphologies. It could indicate something about the stages of magma mixing, or not magma mixing, but magma crystallization, sorry, misspoke, of fractional crystallization. So in 2020, the tail kind of does not illustrate a crystallization of plagioclase. The curve is high where aluminum is, whereas in 2021, the glass is lower and kind of has this hook where that indicates plagioclase, as well as not shown in this graph, but pyroxene crystallization. So this is consistent with Kendra's finding in the olivine record, but more to come. I'll probably be talking about this at AGU if any of you folks are there. But yeah, so that wraps up the chemical data, and I just wanted to end with a discussion on Pele. And if you don't know who Pele is, the Hawaiians understand her to be an akua, or the one translation is god or goddess of the volcano. And it's really important to understand who Pele is and what she is and her power, because she's not only in the past. She's not a myth. She exists now, and she will exist long after we're gone. And in order to understand what I mean by that, I'm going to talk about the history of very briefly of Polynesian voyaging. So on the national parks website, there's this paragraph. And this is what they say about Pele's origins. Pele was born in the distant land of Kahiki and voyaged to the Hawaiian Islands in search of a suitable home. Various accounts of this journey place her her journey sometime between 850 and 1250 CE. And not coincidentally, Polynesians arrived to Hawaii and became Hawaiians at that exact same time. This is key. So if you're not familiar with Polynesian migration, the migration into Oceania, there's like, it went from Asia to like the different islands, and there's like archaeology, and you can see like the, you know, pathway, and like they dated, all the archaeologists dated, like, I don't know, you know, like science and stuff. But the main point of this story is that Hawaiians came from Kahiki, which is Tahiti, to Hawaii. And Polynesians made these voyages because there were islands that existed there. If this was an open ocean with no volcanic islands, no hotspots, or in some cases subduction zones or other remnants of volcanism, there would be no Polynesian voyaging. So my point is that Pele created these islands for Polynesians to become Hawaiians. And that's why Hawaiians consider Pele to be our grandmother, Tutu, our Tutu. And here's a painting of Tutu Pele as an older woman. But who is Pele? Okay. The words God, goddess, and deity are Western creations. They're from a Christian worldview. These translations from missionaries, where people wrote what word means what in from English, from Hawaiian to English. The closest word the missionaries came up with were God and goddess. But Akua is not necessarily a god or goddess. It's not the same thing. Akua is an elemental force. So Pele is not a god or goddess. She is volcanism. Volcanism is observable, interpretable, and fascinating, like all other Akua. And that's not to negate the spirituality of Pele. In fact, I would say that all people have spiritual connections to all Akua. And I'll give you like a task. So I have several Akua listed here: Anuenue, rainbow; Kanaloa, the deep ocean; Tuahine, and Kahaukani, the rain and wind of Mānoa Valley. So those are really specific to location. Those are all natural things that occur, and they're beautiful, and we can study them and interpret them, what they mean, what it means when the rain comes in, what it means, what the deep ocean is like. I hope I'm not breaking up because my thumbnail's doing something weird, but anyway. Hawaiians have a spiritual connection to our Akua, and if you imagine you're one of these two people standing on this hot rock, and you can see the river of lava flowing by, I'm willing to bet that you would too. You would feel the spiritual connection, the awe and amazement. So, and when you hear Pele as the goddess of the volcano, I want you to think, instead of Pele as the goddess of the volcano, I want you to think she is the volcano. She is volcanism. And that's just a different way that I would argue is more accurate to the Hawaiian worldview than to the Western and Christian worldview of gods and goddesses. And I'm happy to chat about that. But yeah, that's everything that I have for you folks. I have some bullet points in case you missed it, of big takeaways of this talk. But I wanted to thank you folks for tuning in. Mahalo nui loa. And I'm happy to field any questions. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mahina. That was a really great presentation, and I really loved these insights on Ikekopuna and the Hawaiian native belief and ancestral knowledge. So now we are open space for a few questions. We have a few minutes for a few questions, so please feel free to unmute yourself or to type them in the chat box.
the 2017 offset is cool. Do you see it in major elements? Oh, thank you for your question, Penny. Of course, the variation is so small, and we can resolve it through like repeating the analysis. I do not see it in majors. But the next steps of the project is to go to lead, strontium, and neodymium isotopes. So we're like crossing our fingers that there's like this amazing difference in isotopes. But yeah, it's just in the trace elements. And there's other ratios as well, like lanthanum, ytterbium, I think, off the top of my head. But thank you for your questions.
Thanks so much. I can't wait to see the isotope data.
Yeah, me too. Thanks. Yeah, I'll have to look at our trend. Yeah. Hey Alex, in the niobium yttrium plot, it almost looked like a mixing line between Pu'o'o and Halemaumau. Is that a misinterpretation on my part, or is part of the current debate that you mentioned regarding olivine data interpretations? Oh yes. Oh no. Okay. So I'm sorry. Let me think about your question. Is the mixing line between Okay. So one thing about sorry, I'm gonna do the thing where I go back a bunch of slides. Sorry. Okay. Oh, I'll go here. So this line here. So the thing about this system is it's kind of weird to think about. With Pu'o'o, the eruption ends, right? So there's no like magma happening. Like if the eruption were to be continued, I would imagine that the chemistry might have been lower if the model that I made was correct. So the reason why I'm using this as the mixing end member for Pu'o'o is because I'm assuming that the Pu'o'o magma is sourced from the summit. There have been geochemical and geophysical studies that show that it's kind of like a constant feed of like magma from the summit to Pu'o'o, and that's why it was like constantly coming out. And there's not like a massive rift storage right where Pu'o'o is. Maybe like deep rifts. And there's been some thoughts about that, but I would consider that yes, I'm testing that it could be the mixing end member. Yes, I hope that answered your question. I apologize if I didn't understand it. Yeah, and there is the debate about the olivine not showing mixing. I had some thoughts about that, but they're not really fleshed out completely. In Kendra's paper, she said that the olivine, there was no evidence of it in the shallow magma system or the shallow reservoir having the like, there was no like reversely zoned crystals, right? But it could be that all this, the synchronization and the mixing could be happening in the South Caldera Reservoir, the deeper reservoir, and maybe that's not something that's shown in the olivine chemistry. But that's still like something I'm thinking about, and I don't have an answer for you. But yeah, thank you for your question.
All right, do we have any more questions? Okay, while we wait for more questions, if there's any, I'm gonna continue spamming you with links. Again, I'm gonna post the webinar series re-registration link. In case you missed what I said earlier, we had an issue with Zoom, so we can't really access the registrant list anymore. So if you help us registering, that'd be great. And if you want to be a speaker for our upcoming webinar sessions, there's also a link in the chat. we have a question from Alan Mahina.
Yeah, I'm happy to thank you guys for all your comments in the chat. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Alan. I'm wondering if the idea of significant storage in the Middle East Rift Zone plays a role into your calculations. Yeah, so I didn't really talk about rift storage in this talk for good reason, because there's not consensus even within my own lab group. But it doesn't take into consideration, I don't take the existence of like a multiple like chamber model in the calculations yet. That's something I want to work up to. I have ideas on how to have, like, if I have magma chamber 1 and magma chamber 2, like what would the chemistry look like through time, since we have such a highly resolved data set through time. But it does not play a role into my current calculation, but it's something I've been thinking about. Thank you for your question.
Okay, I think this is a good point to finish our session for today. I'm gonna let me share my screen very quick. Again, remember we are having this webinar series happening every Tuesday. Every other week on Tuesdays. Again, if you want to register, that's our QR code to the link. And for next session on September 17th, we're gonna have Darren Tan from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's gonna talk about the use of infrasound, seismology, and machine learning in Alaskan volcanoes. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I hope to see you in our next session in 2 weeks. Bye.